Hey, good morning. And we are now in another chapter of Nehemiah. If I were to venture a guess, what some of you might be thinking, coming into this devotional time this morning, if you've had a chance to read over the text before clicking on this video, maybe you're thinking, okay, Chris, here's another long list of names. I mean, this isn't the second or the third time. This is probably, if my memory's correct, the fourth time we've come across a big list of names. What are we going to do with this? I know I kind of saw how you sort of worked your way around getting past that list the first time in the last installment. This is a lot longer list of names. It's spread out over about a chapter and a half. What are you going to do with that? Or maybe you're just simply asking yourself, what can we possibly find that is going to be applicable for us today out of this long list of names? I mean, if you look through this passage, we're talking about all of chapter 11 and half of chapter 12, a little bit more than half of chapter 12. And so what's going to happen this morning is that I'm going to attempt to cover the longest portion of text in any of these devotional videos that we've done. Because what I want to do is I want to keep things in context. I want to move from event to event. Obviously, we're not able to break it down quite into pericope to pericope, but I want us to capture the thought. I feel like if we break it up, we cover just a certain section of verses and say, okay, see you next time, we'll talk about this later, then it breaks up the momentum. And it would require much more review to help us remember what we've just learned and then to catch up and move forward with new material. So rather, yes, this is going to be a lot to cover. We've got to cover all of chapter 11 and the first 26 verses of chapter 12. That's a lot. There are a lot of names in this to wade through as we seek to understand the entirety of Nehemiah's writing. Now, some people could just take that and go, you know what? We did chapter 10. Let's just skip chapter 11. Let's get to chapter 12. Let's get to chapter 12, verse 27 specifically, as we now talk about this dedication worship event where they're dedicating the rebuilding of the wall. I mean, that's an exciting portion of Scripture that I'm looking forward to in the near future. But it's in our best interest to see all of it, to read all of it, to try to exegete all of the text. Now, if this were a preaching series, sure, we might break it down a little bit more, take it chunk by chunk into weeks and weeks of understanding this passage. But since we don't have that benefit for us, in this video, this is what we're going to try to do. We're going to break this down into chunks as we've done before. I want to give you the highlights. I want us to wrestle with this text. And my goal is that after reading it, we will understand the importance of these names, the reasons behind why Nehemiah penned these to begin with, and that God inspired him to write these things down for it to be preserved in our canon of Scripture. So that's what we're going to do this morning. And I'm glad that you're joining with me in this to see this happen. Okay? So I'm going to break it down into chunks. Thankfully, with the help of other gifted theologians and teachers, I've been able to understand this passage more, and I want to share that with you here this morning. So I want to begin in verses 1 through 2. It says this: Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring out 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. So let's talk for a minute about why this is being done. Essentially, people don't want to live in Jerusalem. Now, that might seem weird to us because, like I'm getting ready to take this trip in November to Israel. I'm going to be in Jerusalem. I'm going to be seeing a lot of things there. It is highly valued place to go visit in one's lifetime. So for us New Testament Christians, we're thinking, why would you not want to live in Jerusalem? But there's really a couple of pragmatic reasons why for these people. For one, if they choose to live in Jerusalem, remember what's happened to them. They have been conquered by more than one nation. We could talk about the Assyrians, we could talk about the Babylonians, we can talk about the Persians and so forth. They've suffered their fair share of defeats through time. Granted, a lot of these defeats have come by the judging hand of God in punishment for the way that they have rebelled against him. I understand all that. But if they choose at this point to live in Jerusalem, they're essentially putting a target on their backs. Because what's going to happen is, should an invading nation choose to want to come through, they're not going to be as interested in the people that are living on the outskirts. Yeah, there's a village here, there's a village there. But Jerusalem, oh, that's at the heart of Israel, right? That's where the temple is. That's where the money is. That's where the precious things are. If they want to sack a town, they're not going to worry about some of these, little known towns that I'll mention later on that are towards the end of chapter 11. They're going to go for Jerusalem, which means that the people that live in Jerusalem, their lives are in danger. They could be killed. They could certainly be harmed. So that's one of the reasons, just a pragmatic reason. But the second is this: if they have places to live outside of the town and now they're going to be living in Jerusalem, number one, they're going to have less land, less resources at their availability as they would living on their own homestead outside of the city. So they're going to have to, they're going to have to trust in some other means by which they're going to live and so forth. They're not going to have all the things that they probably would prefer. So living in Jerusalem, they're going to have less land. If you have less land than you originally had, and then let's say you have land outside of the city, well, now here's the question: who's going to take care of my property? Who's going to help me keep what I have that's outside the city while I'm volunteering here to live in the city? Less resources to live on. You've got these two things working against you. But let's not forget, this is the holy city of God. This is where the temple is located. This is where God has set his name. But it's also a dangerous place for people to live. So how do they fix the problem? Well, as we see, they cast lots. They essentially are drawing straws to see who's going to live in the city. 1 out of every 10 people is going to volunteer or be voluntold to live in the city of Jerusalem. So that's how they figure out who's going to be the people that plant new homes outside the city while others plant themselves within the city. So what happens here then is verse 3 through 24 is going to list for us all these people who are going to live in Jerusalem. Then in the later part of chapter 11, verses 25 through 36, it's going to list all these people that are going to live outside of the city, which then takes us to the beginning of chapter 12, verses 1 through 26, which is a list of all the priests and the Levites. Now again, as I've caveated in other devotions, if you have not read through the text yet, it would be to your best interest to do that first so you can understand the things that I'm trying to point out in the text rather than just seeing it in the moment. So if you need to pause the video for a moment, please feel free to do so. But we're going to pick up here in about verse 3 and move our way through the text to the middle of chapter 12, verse 26 there. So if you notice here within the first list, meaning verses 3 through 24, I want you to notice that you're going to see the sons of Judah mentioned in verses 4 through 6. Then you're going to see the sons of Benjamin mentioned in verses 7 through 9. And then that's going to be followed by the priests in verses 10 through 14. Now, after those three lists, you have a fourth list, which is then the Levites. And that covers verses 15 through verse 18. Now, after those four specific groups of people, it becomes a little more ambiguous, and we see the list become more of a miscellaneous kind of listing in verses 19 through 24. But what I want to point out to us is something quite interesting to me as I was reading through here. As these people who are volunteering to live in Jerusalem, they're also being highly praised, as we saw in verse 2. And as they're being highly praised, they're also being given names of high respect. For instance, if you've read through the material, notice in verse 6 that there's a group of men that are called valiant men in verse 6. And then hop over to verse 8, you'll see that they're called men of valor. And then again, skip down to verse 14, you'll see this phrase, mighty men of valor. Now, it's possible that the men that are being focused on here in 6, 8, and 14 are fighting men, men who are ready to take up the sword and spear and shield and to defend Jerusalem should something else occur and they get invaded again. That's quite likely possible. But also, I think it entails the fact that as these people are choosing to dwell in the city, knowing the risks, knowing the dangers, that the people corporately want to show a high level of respect to them for making this sacrifice, for putting forth this valiant effort. So I think it's a both and here. And we see that most of the nations of Israel, really the ones that are remaining, are being mentioned by their patriarchal names. We see the Levites, through Aaron and so forth. We see Benjamin. We see Judah. But I want to point out to you that we see a genealogy in verse 17 that points all the way back to Asaph. Does that sound familiar? Asaph, very likely the same Asaph who has been mentioned in the Psalms. And I say that because of the other evidence seen in verse 17, where this phrase, who was the leader of the praise. So it's very likely that this is the same Asaph who is referenced in the Psalms as one of the writers of some of these Psalms. It's just really neat to see those connections throughout Scripture. And this list of names then, as we focus through and we work our way through it, now we get towards the end of chapter 11 and we're seeing the people that are going to be living on the outside of the city. And they're living in various villages like Kiriath Arba, Dibon, Kezek Bzeel, and Jeshua. And there's a ton of other little villages that are listed in that I didn't want to go through all that time to list them all. But as that takes place, then we see this list of Levites and priests that are in chapter 12. And so in that list, what we're going to see is that it begins with these people who have returned with Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Now let me point out to us that that is the first event of the returning exiles that you can read about in Ezra chapter 2. So you see the connective tissue in all these events here. These are the people in the beginning of chapter 12 that also helped in the rebuilding of the temple during the days of Haggai and Zechariah. In fact, if you don't know much about those minor prophets, I would encourage you go back and listen to the daily devotions that Dr. Beck has just recently completed, where he has systematically walked us through each of the 12 minor prophets, the overarching themes of their books, and some of the implications for us today. So you see Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah. Remember I pointed out some things in Esther and in Daniel. All this connectivity that is going on. This is not just a random explanation of events, but it is one giant story that's told in the meta-narrative of Scripture for us. And so in verses 10 through 22, we're going to see this line of priests in chapter 12 from Joshua on who served during the first exilic return down to the present day of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is also recorded as transpiring in the reign of Darius the Persian. We see that in verse 22 of chapter 12. Now, admittedly, there is conjecture on which Darius it is that we're talking about here. Because actually, if you don't know this, there are several Dariuses that are mentioned historically during this time frame. But as I've studied and looked over varying views and so forth, it seems very likely that, especially with the evidence of Scripture, that it leans more heavily towards the Darius that we know of in the Old Testament, who ruled between the first and the second return of the exiles, as we see that in Scripture. But with all of these people, with all of these lists of names and groups of where they're coming from, I want to make one more major point for us in this. The final thing that I want to point out as we're kind of getting towards the end of this larger chunk of chapter 12 is that there's a choreographed way in which the priests are preparing for worship. Did you notice in verse 24, we see the chiefs of the Levites with their brothers, it says, who are standing opposite of each other. And then it states the reason. It says, to praise and to give thanks, according to the commandment of David, the man of God, watch by watch. So essentially what you're seeing here is two choir-like groups being formed, facing each other, as if they are going to participate in some kind of antiphonal singing or some kind of call and echo sort of format. But whatever this purpose is, there is a clear intentionality in their worship preparations and in the artistry that's at play. As they are preparing, which we're going to see more of this later in chapter 12, they're going to prepare to engage in my honest opinion, what is the most glorious worship service recorded in the entire book. I don't mean the entire book of Scripture, but just in the book of Nehemiah. It is this beautiful worship service as they are dedicating the reconstruction of the wall to the Lord. And so they're going to work in tandem with one another as this singular force for the purpose of renewed worship of God in the city of Jerusalem. And I'm really excited about talking about that and where we're going to find in the rest of chapter 12 as we start to dive into these next couple of installments. But what I hope that you're gathering out of this devotion this morning, I mean, this is a large portion of Scripture, I admit, all of chapter 11 and halfway through chapter 12. But I hope that you'll discover in that kind of survey that we've had to take through this larger text is that these names are not merely attendance records for us to just gloss over. They have a purpose. They're telling us a story. I mean, think about it. If we just read through these names, it'd be like, okay, who cares? But yet now we understand that there's a list of names of people who have voluntarily decided to live in the city of Jerusalem and why that is so significant. Then we begin to see the people that have dwelt outside of the city and how they've scattered around to rebuild their homesteads. Then we see the great group of Levites and priests who are going to be crafting the liturgy of worship that is about to take place toward the end of chapter 12. All of these lists of names, all of these peoples, even as we look at the name of Asaph hidden there, and well, not hidden really, but as we see that kind of interlined with other portions of text, it's amazing to see how all this stuff ties together. Even as we look at the different names, we can see genealogies of people of Israel tracing back to earlier parts of the Old Testament. I mean, this is what that stuff is there for. They have purpose. They tell us a story. There is meaning for us, even 21st century Christians. There is things in these lists of names for us to gain from reading them. And so hopefully, in my feeble way of doing so, I've been able to connect some of those dots for you in a way that helps you to understand why Nehemiah wrote these things down, why God inspired Nehemiah to write these things down. As we look through this text of Scripture together, remember, we want to give the whole counsel of God. We want every portion of Scripture, as Paul says to Timothy, to be profitable for your growing in grace and knowledge of Christ. So, I hope that's what's happened this morning. I hope you understand this text a little bit more. I'm always available to answer deeper questions if you want to reach out to me and say, well, what about this or what about that? Since we have such a limited time to cover these things, please feel free to reach out anytime you want. But again, I want to thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to sharing more with you next time.